Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. If you haven't bought Pink Pilled, I highly recommend you do. It's a brilliant book. There's so much in there. There's so much to think about. It's packed with kind of very astute analysis. It's very balanced and nuanced, but also confident and coherent. And like I say, there's so much in there. You've clearly got an encyclopedic knowledge of the far right. From a long time, since a teenager. So well done. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Can you guys hear me right, by the way? Okay, cool, good.
So do you want to tell us what sparked your initial idea and impetus for the book?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, thank you for introducing it so nicely. The idea had been brewing for quite a long time. As I talk about in the opening chapter of the book, I kind of grew up alongside the manosphere and was weirdly obsessed with it in a kind of scab you can't stop picking at kind of way. And I kind of watched the manosphere as it moved from this weird niche internet community of pickup artists and men's rights activists to become something very radicalized. And by time Trump took office the first time in 2020, a lot of the people in his sphere were people who would kind of come up through the manosphere or were connected to it in some way. But during that time, I kind of kept noticing lots of women popping up in that community that really surprised me. And I was also doing, if I would go to counter demos and stuff against people like Tommy Robinson, I kept seeing women on the other side of the little barricade that the police always set up to try and keep you separated. And I kept being why the fuck are you guys on that side? You should be on this side of us. And it was about that same time where, I don't know if you guys remember this, but the video How to Wear Makeup in a God-Honouring Way went viral by Girl Fascism. Not Girl Fascism. Spoiler. By Girl Defined. And I remember I watched that video and I went back to their blog and just looking through it and realizing how much of the language that they were using was mirroring the language that I was seeing in the manosphere. And that is kind of what kind of sparked me looking into the women in these communities, what roles they were playing and why, because I just couldn't understand what was in it for them. It's been several years in the making.
And I guess you've looked through a lot of very disturbing content in that time. A lot of vicarious trauma. That blog, Girl Defined, because I think you made a really good point in the book, which is that with Girl Defined, ostensibly, I mean, it's not as bad as what's the blog, the kind of the outward facing content is not as extreme as the blog and the other stuff. And that's a lot of far right content. You've got this fluffier, well, it's not fluffy, none of it's fluffy, but less extreme content that lures you in. And then, if you go just that little bit deeper, you can just easily get sucked into this rabbit warren of hell. Can you just talk us through some of the main ways that, women get radicalized into the far right? The point that you make in your book, which is that there's so many different ways and also there isn't one set character profile. So I thought that you made that point really well.
Sure, thank you. I think, as you just touched on, this idea of forward-facing media and backward-facing media in, radicalization. I'm going to do this the first time because, the concept of radicalization is a bit loose around the edges, but for shorthand, I'm just going to say it. It's, really common for them to do, forward-facing media and backwards-facing media, where their forward-facing media, as you said, is more, it's much more in the middle of the Overton window, of the window of acceptable discourse. So it might be things where they say they're just asking questions or they want to wear makeup in a God-honouring way. And then if you kind of follow this back a few steps into kind of not even dark socials, although obviously that's kind of where you end up eventually, things kind of get more extreme and more kind of radical as you flow through that pipeline. Again, pipeline really contentious. We can talk about that later if you want. But I think there's lots of different kind of tactics that are being used. And I think there's lots of different kind of content buckets is maybe a way you could say it, of transphobia is a really key one. femo-nationalism is a really key discussion. Wellness and kind of anti-fatness and medical misogyny are really key ones. Tradwife, which kind of encompasses all of them. But as you said, there's not like one like breed of woman in the far right. There's lots of like girl defined, for example, are evangelicals, and so their politics is driven by evangelicalism. They're quite big in like the far right movement in the US. And then you have more like politically driven women, so they might be the more tradwifey or the militia wives. And then you kind of have the third fun category that I call grifters, which are the people that are like literally just in it to make money. So yeah, there's lots of different tactics maybe. I think a question I had while writing the book a lot, and one that I don't think I solidly answered or still haven't answered myself, is like, how deliberate were the far right in attempting to recruit women? Because they're very deliberate in wanting to recruit men, but there seemed to be less like formality around the systems through which women were ending up in these communities. Often it felt almost like, you know, they kind of ended up there accidentally through kind of tactics being used to recruit men. Yeah,
and I guess so much, is opportunistic, you know, far right recruitment. And some of the ways that people end up might in some ways seem kind of arbitrary, or not arbitrary, but just there's a randomness, and I guess an arbitrariness to it. And you use that analogy of it being like an ocean, which I really liked. But maybe we can get into that later. Can you talk me through some of the different roles that women play in far right movements? Because I thought that was really interesting, how you conceptualize like the different roles.
Yeah, I think when we talk about like women being radicalized or women joining these movements, radicalization in like academic literature is often talked about as like several different metaphors, usually like steps or an iceberg or something where it is broader and less extreme at the bottom, and then like much narrower and less populated but much more extreme at the top. And like the very top of like the radicalization iceberg is extremism or terrorism, right? And women in the far right are not really committing what we might call like acts of terrorism. It has happened, there has been some like mass shooters who are like white nationalist women, but so far there's not been like a huge amount of like violence in the same way white nationalist men are committing violence. So when we talk about women getting radicalized, they're getting to these like upper echelons, but they're not like doing that type of violence. So the role they play in these movements, they often facilitate that violence. So they might be involved in planning, they might be involved in helping to radicalize and propagandize to men who then do end up doing that violence. Often, as in like wider society, women play like a very reproductive role in that they exist there to like reproduce the movement. So they're doing like the admin work, the really boring like housework of white nationalism, but like that is so necessary in order for like the violence to take place. They also act as propagandists, is like one of their really big roles in these movements, because of this like idea that women are safer and less violent than men. It's often called like femo washing or like female washing, where women will spout these ideas or like propagandize these ideas, and it seems like safer and, like you said, fluffier than when men are talking about it. Like for femo-nationalism, that's been really, really like effective, where women talk about wanting to be protected from immigrant men or from men of colour, and it feels like a more legitimate conversation when they're doing it than when like men in the far right talk about anti-immigration. So I think that's like one of the big roles they play, is kind of propagandists and of like organisers, and almost like housewives and mothers for the far right.
No, totally. And so often their roles in the movement are quite, admin focused, and also quite invisible, some of the roles, like, but then again, you do get, if you look at like major kind of far right rallies, like say Charlottesville or, 6th of January, or say Richard Spencer, the party celebrating Trump winning, there are also women at these like pretty, obviously very extreme events. So I guess I think it's just there's a real lack of research into women within the far right. In the same way, there's a lack of research and attention on that intersection between misogyny and the far right. And I don't know, maybe that's also because so many of the people that research the far right are men, so maybe they're less interested in some of the misogynistic elements. I don't know. It's so, I guess, but yeah, there's not many people doing the research that you're doing at all.
Male far right academics do catch some strays in this book from me, just like a few things, and I'm like, oh, you guys could be doing this in a different way. I think it's really interesting that you mentioned like Charlottesville and Jansik, and also Richard Spencer's whatever that was, because it was actually like a women's organisation. It was Women for Trump that secured a lot of the like permits for people to be at the Capitol on Jan 6th. They did a lot of organising of like the transportation for people to be at Jan 6th. And at Charlottesville, women were supposed to talk. I think it was Lana Lakhtoff was supposed to talk there, and then eventually decided not to because they thought it'd be too dangerous. So women are really involved in these like moments of violence, and they're just not, they're not doing what often is defined by men as like real violence. Yeah,
no, totally. And yeah, can you describe what pink pilling is? Because I remember we met earlier this week, didn't you? And you were saying that that's the question that everyone wants to know.
So pink pilling is not a term that's like hugely used by the far right themselves. It's more kind of a term that I use kind of for the book. Some small corners of like the far right internet do use it to talk about a specific type of like radicalization path for women, which is usually the kind of like divine feminine romance path. So if you've seen the like sprinkle sprinkle woman on TikTok, or the kind of, there's an R pink pilled subreddit, but a lot of it is them wanting to be like a high value woman in order to get a high value man. That is like the specific language used in the pink pilled communities. But I used it throughout the book to kind of talk more broadly about the ways in which women enter the far right or are radicalized into the far right, to kind of how that differs from men. Obviously they use the term red pilling for most people, or peaked if they're TERFs.
Yeah, some of the language that the far right use. I mean,
my brain was scrambled for a couple of years. I would like say stuff, and my housemate would be like, "What?" And I'd be like, "Oh, sorry." Like,
yeah, you could do a whole book just on the like kind of glossary.
But that is also a tactic of having this specific lexicon, because it works in two ways to create this kind of like in-group feeling where you're like one of the cool kids who knows what the language is. But it also helps to kind of make it harder for people to like understand what's happening in these communities. It makes it harder for like, if your son starts talking about looks maxing at the dinner table, you're like, what the fuck is this? It's like, you're gonna intervene a lot less soon than if he started talking about like eugenics, right?
Yeah, totally. And I guess it is like, even as someone who's on the outside of the movement, obviously, I guess there is something quite, slang is fun, like, and so it lures people in, because it's quite, like you say, you feel like you're part of this in club. I wondered, I know you've explored in the book the fact that, women in the movement, experience violence and abuse, harassment, unsurprisingly. You can see some of this playing out online, and then also, kind of behind the scenes. And you made a really interesting point in the book. It's just one of those things that, I'd never really thought about, but like, what do you do when somebody, and I guess it's a broader question that transcends like what we're talking about here tonight. But when some women in the movement are, experiencing really horrific abuse, but they themselves are also, hold incredibly abhorrent, bigoted views. How do you protect them? How do you hold these two things at the same time?
Yeah, I think like the phrase I used in the book was like, no one's going to fund a shelter for neo-Nazis. But I think like something that I think is missing from the conversation about de-radicalization or about preventing people joining these movements is that like once women are in these movements, they're in such a vulnerable position, especially if they're in the kind of like evangelical branch or in these like traditional relationships where, you know, they're not controlling their own finances, they don't have a job, they have children with these people. There's a lot of conversation about like, you know, how can we change people's hearts and minds and bring people out of these movements or whatever. But I think more pragmatically, like, it doesn't matter if someone has changed her mind if she has nowhere safe to go with her children. And there isn't like that kind of consideration yet about like, we're seeing all these girls online being like, I'm a stay-at-home girlfriend, I don't have a career so I can look after my boyfriend. And it's so scary to think like, in a few years' time, it's happening now, when this is no longer trendy or when your boyfriend leaves, like, where do you go? And I think women are being left in this like really like vulnerable position. But then we have to try and hold these two things of like, these people are victims and they're vulnerable, but they're also have done and contributed to like really dangerous and violent movements. And so how can we kind of acknowledge the harm being done to them as well as the harm they're doing? And I think in the book I kind of advocate for moving away from this binary of like victim aggressor when it comes to like sexual violence, which I think is very entrenched in the like conversations around sexual violence, in order to like, I don't know, we can't like de-radicalize women from these movements without addressing the lack of support for survivors.
Totally. And do you want to talk us through, some of the examples of abuse and, violence that women have faced who are in the far right, you know, among their contemporaries?
Yeah, like I won't get too deep into it because it's a bit grim.
Well,
But I think like Laura Southern, right? She was like one of the poster girls of the identitarian movement. She was kind of everywhere a couple of years ago. She has since talked about how she was married to a man in the movement. When she was first kind of working with like Rebel News and had her big YouTube channel, she was advocating for like women's role to be staying at home and having children and getting married. And she was getting so much shit behind the scenes because she was like 23, 24 and not married, had no kids. And she talks a lot, if you read some of her old interviews, about kind of the harassment and the violence and that she was experiencing from these men who kind of just saw her as a piece of meat, basically, in the movement. And she left for a few years, and then she came back and she married someone within the movement and has kind of since left again. And I read this really chilling interview with her where she talked about how, you know, the movement was still using her in these videos where she's very forward-facing, talking about how, like, the far right protects women, the far right is the only thing that's going to protect women. And then meanwhile, she was regularly having to take her kid and like shelter next door with her neighbours because her husband was so violent. I mean, that was like an example that's really stayed with me. But this is what I mean by women often try to leave and then can't because of these pragmatic reasons.
Yeah, and I guess it's this kind of comes back to this idea that women that get involved in the far right often see their whitehood as being, as trumping, as eclipsing their gender, and then, and I guess it's they seem to find it hard, maybe, without generalising, to kind of come to terms with or accept, you know, the fact that actually those around them, you know, are male supremacists, are like raging misogynists, but then they kind of cling on to the movement because, oh, well, like you say, you know, they've got power over, you know, migrants or, you know, whichever oppressed group it is that they're trying to, you know, dominate. But then actually, they are seen. But then so many of them are publicly pushing the fact that they believe that women are, you know, biologically determined to be subservient to men. So it's quite a... The first word that comes to mind is a head fuck, really.
Yeah, the sleight of hand I often saw them doing when they were kind of talking about how women should be at home having babies and shouldn't have jobs is they would often be like, oh, I wish I could just stay home and not work and just have babies, but these horrible liberal feminists are forcing me to like advocate against, you know, all these horrible things they're doing that are destroying the West. So they're obviously really benefiting in some ways from this fame and from this like their position in the movement, and the kind of the way they justify that to themselves and their followers is by saying like, I would love to just be like baking bread, whatever, but I have to fight for the West. Honestly, that's like an almost direct quote from some of them. But you're so right in saying that like they are aligning with their whiteness more than they're aligning with their womanhood. And like they're being offered power through their white identity, which they feel is being denied to them in a kind of more multicultural society. And in order to like have that power of whiteness, they are willing in some ways to be subjugated as women. Although they would argue that maybe it's not subjugating because women secretly, they just want to be treated like that.
Yeah. Because I guess that feels like one of the major questions that your book is trying to answer, which is, you know, why do you think the far right is appealing for women, given that, misogyny is at the heart of far right ideology and not in a veiled way, you know, overtly, openly. So, I guess that's such a big question, but like, what are the main reasons why you think it is still appealing for them?
Yeah, I think, again, it depends on like what branch of the far right it is. I think for like evangelicals in the far right, it is this idea of like, you are returning to God's idea of womanhood. That was like a big one that I kept seeing. And then I think for a lot of people, it is this idea of, again, like power as white women. I don't have my little notebook with academics written down, but the concept is aggrieved entitlement, and this idea that like as white people, like we are owed this power, this supremacy, and that is being like denied to us in this like modern society. And so they're kind of fighting back against that, and they want that power as white people. But also for a lot of them, this idea that like you are a warrior, you are a goddess just by like what your body can do is quite appealing. Like it's a very natalist movement. If you are someone who is maybe feeling a bit dissatisfied with your life, a bit lost about what to do, and then you have lots of people saying to you like, just by being a white woman, just by being able to give birth, you are like saving our civilization. That feels really powerful. That feels really like special. And so for a lot of them, this like natalism really appeals to them, which is why we see so much of like the anti-abortion and anti-birth control stuff that's happening within those communities right now. Yeah,
and the intersection, like you touched on before, between wellness and, you know, this clampdown on reproductive freedom, and how many people, like how often wellness can kind of act as a gateway to, you know, much, kind of darker world of far right thought is really interesting. And I feel like something that, while it is talked about now more than it was, still a lot of, you know, people are probably unaware of. And another question was something that I'd never thought about until, coming across the book, which was the intersection between AI, obviously the thing everyone's talking about, and the far right. So can you talk us through a little bit of that?
Yeah, when I was like writing this book, it was kind of just at like that beginning of like the AI boom that we're seeing now. And I was starting to see a little bit of like AI generated content being used in these far right digi spaces. The far right is really good at like jumping on new technology. Like if you look at any far right movement throughout history, like, you know, they were the first to be all over the radio. The first like DBBS. Someone who's good at computers. Do I mean DDBS or DBBS? Database thing.
Okay, we don't
know
what audience of technophobes.
But one of the first things uploaded onto like the thing that came before the internet was neo-Nazi material that was uploaded in Germany because it's like illegal to print and distribute there, but there weren't yet laws about what you could put on these databases. And so the far right has always been like really ahead of the curve in terms of new tech, and they are absolutely all over AI at the moment. Something really interesting that the ADF has been doing recently is using these like AI generated female influencers on TikTok, where like it's not even a real woman talking about how she needs to be protected from invaders. It's like this horrible like generated character. And so, you know, I think that fits really nicely, or is a really good example of how these movements need women to like make their ideas seem softer and more approachable, but they hate women and they don't want women in their movements. And so if they can create like a fake woman to do that, that is the dream. And they're all over it at the moment.
Yeah, that is perfect. And I guess it's just, you know, sitting here tonight, obviously, when did I do my event here? It was January 2024 with Nadia Whittam, Labour MP. And just generally being on panels, often talking about the rise of the far right the last few years. And then now it's just everything is on steroids. With Trump in the White House and Musk and just you just open the news and it's just some other shocking thing. So it feels like they really have, in a kind of tangible, concrete way, you can see the power, growing by the day.
Yeah, I think when I first started, this was a podcast before it was a book. I made it in 2020. And then it became a book 2 years later. When I was first working on this project, these people were just kind of weird internet creeps. They had a lot of power, but it was still quite a niche topic. And then now they're the most powerful people in the world. In every kind of country you can name, the far right is either in power or is second or third in the pollings, right? And there are lots of across Europe particularly, there are lots of women heading far right parties. I don't think those women were radicalised online. Some of them may have been, but women are having really important roles in just far right party politics right now.
Yeah, and so it's, I guess it's a good time for the book to come out, really.
It is, but it feels bad to say that.
Yeah, it feels bad to say that, but yeah. No, totally. And another question would be, of course, women in far right movements are not, a monolithic entity in the same way the far right is in no way a monolithic entity, or women as a whole. But if you were to try and kind of summarise a character profile of those that might be vulnerable to being, lured in, where would you start with that?
I think I didn't put this theory in the book, but when I was doing all my research, I put all of the women into 3 categories in my mind. And those 3 categories were grifters, who I have mentioned, true believers, and then seekers. Seekers is a term you do hear knocking about in research on radicalisation and stuff. It basically means people who really feel something is missing in their life and they are just seeking something out. They often, before they end up in radicalised communities, will have a history of, joining lots of different groups or movements before they find one that works for them. There's a big overlap between people in that community and struggles with addiction. And then the true believers, the people who really do believe it, often are born into it or have kind of gone through this very thorough radicalization themselves. So people Girl Defined were true believers. They are possibly deconstructing right now, but who knows? Laura Southern, true believer. And then there are the griftier ones who are just in it to make money and who are in it for the power and the notoriety. But I think going broader, the big kind of through lines of who are women in the far right, overwhelmingly they are white women and they are cisgender women. When we talk about far right women, there are a few trans women who are in the far right, but it is overwhelmingly cisgender women because it is a cis supremacist movement in the same way it's a male supremacist movement. And they are often in these communities for their actual reproductive, as in biological reproductive capabilities. So white women, cis women, overwhelmingly are the women in the far right.
Yeah, God.
Sorry.
Heavy stuff. No, I think, because full disclaimer, I interviewed you for The Independent about the book. And I thought that was interesting when you made the point, about the grifters in the movement and just how the fitness, you said to me, the fitness wellness industry is quite saturated and that maybe some of these women in the far right, if they could make money in other areas, they would. So I guess, there's a lot of people profiting off hate, they're not the only ones. Andrew Tate, he's made a lot of money from it. But I guess it just feels without going on a tangent, we're just in such a different place now. We've got the Trump administration pressuring the Romanian authorities to, lessen the restrictions on Tate. So it does just feel like everything's, gone into turbocharged.
I only finished this book maybe maybe September was when I like MEP was like, no more, you cannot touch it again. But like if I could, I would like rewrite the entire final chapter now maybe, because even in that time, like the landscape of the internet has changed so much. Like in the final chapter, I talk a bit about some of the academic literature around like tech moderation and how tech companies can like work with governments to try and prevent like extremist content online. And I think like, you know, we've had that thing where Musk now, he owned Twitter when I was writing this, but Twitter is like a write-off in terms of doing anything about the hate on there. And now we're seeing like Facebook and Meta, like Mark Zuckerberg saying, you know, companies need to have more masculine energy or whatever that was. And so I think I would completely change the stuff I'd written about like what can tech and social media sites do to try and combat extremism, because I think fundamentally like it's in their interest not to do that. They make money off it. So yeah, I would rewrite that slightly.
Yeah, it's a lot's happened in that time. Like a lot's changing so quickly. You know, probably we'll check the news after this event and something else will have happened. So yeah, a bit more of a positive question now, and obviously this is a hard one. So I was going to ask, you know, what can we do to counter the pink pilling tactics wielded by the far right, and just stop women being radicalised online, or, you know, if you don't want to use the term pink pilling, being red pilled. I guess you make this point in the book that I thought was really perceptive, which was that kind of trying to bring people back to reality a bit, but it's just so hard in the sense that just, you know, when you're talking to people in the far right, I mean, if you're talking to them or you're thinking about talking to them, you know, obviously it's a spectrum, and, you know, let's say you've got somebody that believes in like Pizzagate, or you've got somebody who believes so many, like in the manosphere, they will say things like, and I'll see this in comments and stuff like on my social media, like it's quite common to think that most of the men in prison who are there because of being charged with rape, that they, you know, that it was false allegations, that they shouldn't be there, that the majority of them are actually innocent. Or then, you know, on a slightly less extreme side of it, you might have somebody who says like, oh, if you have, let's say you're a woman, you're someone of a marginalised gender, you've had some domestic abuse against you, some form of rape, and you don't go to the police, you know, within a few days or a few months, and it didn't really happen and you're lying, you know, and trying to find common ground with somebody who thinks like that, which is such a kind of horrible way to think, so devoid of empathy, or like other views which would be common would be, I guess just so many of them think that the majority of allegations are false. So it is so hard to find this common ground, or to try and, you know, move people back from these views when, without sounding like patronising or condescending, you do just feel like you're speaking a bit of a different language to them.
There's a lot of these people that I don't think we should be finding any common ground
No.
But like when I was speaking to experts for like the final chapter, I kind of talked a bit about the future and what we can be doing to maybe try and prevent people from like getting into these communities. I was quite surprised by like some of the answers I gave. The answer that came up like again and again from people was just like better education from a much younger age. And that's not just like education about politics, but people were talking about better like sex education, better education about like women's issues, starting like, you know, obviously appropriately, but like young. Like I spoke to the co-founder of like the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism, and she was very like clear that like talking to young women at like young girls at an early age about like the issues women face means that it's a lot harder to like exploit those pain points. Because I think something that became really obvious to me throughout the book was like, controversially, I think a lot of men in the far right, like their issues are just bullshit and I don't care about them. Whereas like a lot of the women, if you like dig down deep enough, there is an actual legitimate pain that you're hitting on. Like with the wellness stuff, often they ended up in these communities because they'd experienced like medical misogyny, or they'd had like a really traumatic birthing experience, and they tried to like seek out different, different like medical things, and then they end up in these kind of like radicalizing communities. So for a lot of women, I'm loath to say it, but if you go down far enough, there are like some legitimate issues that they're facing, but like they're doing the right math, they're doing the right math and getting the wrong answer. And so I think just like starting younger with like educating women and kind of all people is really important. I think also the other thing a lot of these like experts pressed on was like, we need a myriad of tactics. Like the far right is using a myriad of tactics. They're not just doing one thing. And so in order to counter that, we need to have like a myriad of tactics as well with like education. Like, yes, some tech moderation might be helpful, but like on the ground organising and movements, like reaching young people in schools, things like that. So I think like there are lots of things we can be doing, but like one of the really appealing things about the far right is that they offer simple answers to complex questions. And in order to counter that, we need to start offering complex answers to complex questions, but like working harder at doing that.
Definitely. And I think, that's a point that Naomi Klein makes really well. When I interviewed her, that's not a name drop, that's just because she's more articulate than me. But yeah, no, she made a really good point, which is that why conspiracy theories can be so appealing to people is because they just offer kind of quick, easy solutions like, hey, I know we get to the bottom of that, major geopolitical event by, we just arrest those 5 guys, put them in handcuffs, rather than realising, that the forces of capitalism are a lot more entrenched and it's a lot more complicated than that. And then I guess it's also, in a lot of conspiracy theories, there's a kernel of truth, and in some ways, the solutions which a lot of conspiracy theories offer up, are quicker to implement. That kind of caricature view of seeing people as baddies is really appealing for some people. But just to touch on something, because I'm just going to read a bit from your book that I thought was really, really good. Because it's just kind of, I feel like so much in the book, it just makes you think, yes, I agree with that. You've said it in a really clear way, something that's actually quite complex, but you've really kind of like made sense of something. So finding an answer to why women are attracted to the far right doesn't provide a simple method for dissuading them. Unlike a lot of the perceived frustrations of men in these communities, including the loss of power as white men in an increasingly multicultural society and the loss of access to women that they feel entitled to, the pain points being exploited to radicalise women are rooted in their marginalisation. So I thought that was, really, it's just hard to think of solutions for these things.
I think like one of the experts I spoke to was just like, if we want to stop women getting radicalised, we have to like end the patriarchy. And I was like, oh, fuck, that's a lot of work. But I think that's like one of the big issues, right?
Yeah,
it's like,
no, definitely. And I guess just the far right, they're so good at exploiting people's fears and anger, and maybe like lack of knowledge about a particular issue.
I think something you said earlier was really like salient, is that like it's a very opportunistic movement. Like something that I struggled with writing is that people want answers to like, but what do they believe about women? What do they believe about trans people, blah, blah, blah. And the answer is often like kind of whatever's the most convenient to them. Like you can unpick this ideology, and I think it's important to do so, to kind of like know your enemy and understand what they're arguing. But like at the end of the day, some of them are just like, well, it's common sense. They don't have an answer for why they believe this. And so sometimes when countering it, we just have to accept that like these people believe it because it makes them feel good, and like they don't have an ideology behind it, and it is just common sense to them.
Definitely.
And it's very opportunistic.
Yeah, and I think that point that you make, that they're not ideologues, all of them, that some of them are, but not all of them are super ideologically motivated, is really salient, because sometimes maybe, they're seen as like all being super ideologically driven.
And like some of them definitely are.
Yeah,
some of them are like quoting Nick Land in a way that you're like, get a hobby. But then like some of them just like don't actually believe anything.
Yeah, and I guess probably in the same way I remember from my journalism masters at Goldsmiths, we were like, you'd read these academic articles where people were like deconstructing Daily Mail articles and things, and like it was just like a lot of these had been, you know, they're written by you know, people in like half an hour, and and I'm not saying that it's not important to deconstruct it and that the academic research is founded, but that just that sometimes there's not necessarily as much thought that goes into things as you'd think. Sorry, that went super loud. But another question would be is, as we've discussed tonight, we're witnessing a rise in the far right around the world. How are you feeling about this?
I feel bad about it.
Yeah.
It's really scary. Like, I think one of my oldest friends is here, and she might be able to attest to this, but like, for years, even before I wrote this book, I would be saying to people like, oh, I think we might live through like a period of global fascism, and everyone would be like, you're so crazy. And now like I say that and people are like, oh yeah, maybe. And it feels really fucking scary. Like, people keep talking about this book has come at a good time, or like, you know, it's a salient time, whatever. But actually I feel like it's come too late. Like, if we had been talking about this, writing about this, publishing about this, having, you know, addressing this, maybe in like, there was a moment in 2016 where it would have made a difference. But I think like now, obviously we keep fighting, we keep countering, but like, it almost feels like we're locking the stable after the horse has bolted a little bit. And yeah, I think like, for me, my focus now is maybe just on like building strong communities. So yeah, I feel not great.
Yeah, no, fair enough. It feels like everything's kind of speeding up in intensity very quickly, and just the idea that you know, Keir Starmer could be inviting Trump to come and speak to Parliament, like that's just crazy. It just feels like we're in one long Black Mirror episode, and just, I know that's probably an analogy that's used a lot, and it's a bit of overdone cliche, but it does feel a bit like a parody. And like, you know, with Musk at the conference the other weekend, the Conservative conference, like waving around the chainsaw, it's just like just absolutely crazy.
It feels like, you know, we talk about like the Overton window of like acceptable discourse. It feels like that just doesn't really exist anymore, of like, what isn't acceptable to talk about on the public stage at this point. And I don't know how we like walk back from that anyway.
And I guess a lot of it, like, without sounding conspiratorial or like, you know, like a real Luddite, but a lot of it feels like with this globalized social media, it's so easy for things to kind of spread so quickly. And even I've seen with like, just friends, like, or not so much like close friends, but like people I know getting into Andrew Tate, and it just feels like, and men I know, not ones like, you know, not close friends, but people just kind of more like acquaintances, you know, and sometimes I'm out and they're coming up to me and just like parroting some quite worrying views. It feels like there's a lot of anger among men who are not necessarily in the far right, who would maybe say, you know, that, I don't know where they necessarily align themselves politically, but maybe some of them would say that they're like lefties or centrists, and some of them just saying some quite like very, very angry at feminism, blaming feminism for a lot of things that feminism's got nothing to do with, and also totally misunderstanding what feminism is. So it feels like, the misogynistic elements of the far right, kind of, these views that a lot of people hold, or a lot of men mostly hold, are seen as being quite fringe and peripheral, but actually, you know, a lot of people think them, but maybe they wouldn't necessarily say them to others, and maybe they show them with their actions rather than their words, how they treat their wife, their partner, what they expect from them.
Yeah, I mean, I could go off on a little tangent about like men in leftist spaces who, like, you know, have this great politics, but then are still kind of expecting their wives to be doing the majority of like domestic labor. But I think, I don't know if you guys have seen this, but there was that graph that came out in like Forbes, maybe, like a year ago, that was kind of this really great exploration of like young men have gone so sharply right, and kind of how women are still kind of trending left at the moment, but like globally, the shift has been really extreme, and in younger men as well. Like Gen Z men are some of the like most right wing, one of the most right wing generations.
It's scary. No, because I've reported on Andrew Tate a lot. And yeah, I remember I did some research from YouGov, some research they did for me, which found like around a quarter of young men, agree with Andrew Tate's views on how women should be treated. And then I remember I did some other research with Hope Not Hate, and they found that, more young men had consumed content from Andrew Tate than had heard of Rishi Sunak. That was when he was in power. And it's just really, depressing. And that research, the research that's finding the ideological gap between young men and women is really growing, and young men becoming more socially conservative. And I guess it really bucks the trend that we've seen throughout history, where we think of, people getting more conservative as they get older.
I think something about the book that I worried about is that like overwhelmingly the far right is still like a male dominated space. Most of the people in the far right are men, and I didn't want the book to create a moment where like people were disproportionately blaming women, or like saying that women were driving these movements, because people love to blame women for things. Like when we talk about the far right and like the power it's gaining, that is overwhelmingly driven by men, but women are still playing like an important part in that.
Yeah, but I think the book is so good at kind of capturing a nuanced view of things. And I think it's good, to like hold women in the movement accountable to things. And to me, that feels like, the antithesis of that kind of girl boss, lean-in feminism, as they call it, where it's just like women back women, no matter who they are, which is so like condescending, and just, I hate that stuff. So.
The tagline of the podcast was like, women can be anything, including fascists.
Yeah.
And I think like that is what the point of the book is like, women, often because of like benevolent sexism, there's this like halo effect, especially around white women, that like they can, we can do no wrong. And that has been has protected a lot of women in these movements for a really long time.
Definitely. And so we'll open up to questions soon, so have a little think. But one last question would be, this is one of those questions I've definitely been asked a lot, so I'm sorry, I always find it hard to know how to answer. But do you have any tips on how people can stay positive and hopeful in the face of growing far-right movements?
Ooh, do I?
Have a bubble bath.
Have a bubble bath, that's fun. Look after yourself, get involved in community stuff. There's some cool, Black Lodge Press stuff up here. I think his thing of, ride bikes, grow a garden, hail Satan is pretty good advice. Maybe do that. I don't know. I think just, get involved in community groups and actions if you can is maybe my tip and advice. And queer nightlife's really good right now. Go to some...
We have covered a lot of ground, I think.
Sorry, I've been talking at you guys for ages.
Thank you so much. It's an amazing book.
Thank you.
It really is. There's so much in there. So, buy it and you can get it signed now. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Maya. It's really useful.